Hey, welcome back to Bridal Rays. This week we are looking at a study called It Is Enough, and we're looking at Genesis chapter 45. So if you're following along, we're in Genesis chapter 45. We're going to look at the whole chapter this week. And today we're looking at verses 1 through 15, and I call this I Am Joseph. And we get the revealing of Joseph to his brothers in this story today. So let's begin. After hearing the plead of Judah on behalf of Benjamin, Joseph found that he could no longer keep his emotions under wraps. You know, you can imagine. I mean, he loves his brother. He doesn't hate them. There's no animosity towards them at all in Joseph. And so, you know, his reasons to hide himself and to test his brothers have been satisfied enough in his mind, at least enough so that they can be overwhelmed by his emotions. You know, his head is not able to control his heart anymore, and so he's overwhelmed. He's overwhelmed by the love for his brother Benjamin, but also his whole family too. And so Joseph cries out. He can't hold it back any longer. He says, "Make everyone go out from me." So he yells at the servants to go out. Everyone leaves except for his brothers, and they're alone in the room now. And what he was about to do was not really appropriate for a man of his status, especially if he is considered to be really one of the Egyptians now. And so, you know, he shouldn't be doing what he's about to do. So Joseph wants to be free to express himself to his brothers. He doesn't want to be hindered by societal standards or anything else like that. So he makes everyone leave. That would allow him to do that. And so everyone goes out, and you know, he wants to put off the Egyptian official persona and put on the Hebrew brother of his brothers. Then Joseph begins to weep. Before he says anything, he begins to cry loudly that even the servants outside the room could hear. So he's weeping loudly, and through his tears he can blurt out, you know, "I am Joseph." And he says, "Is my father still alive?" So he's able to get out a few words. And, you know, for the brothers, I mean, the brothers knew this man who's crying before them as Zaphenath-paneah. And so they're like, I'm sure they're probably wondering what in the world is going on. But now he's saying that his name is Joseph, and he's speaking in their language. You know, before he was talking through an interpreter. So the description of the brothers' response to the news is almost humorous. It says they could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. They're looking at this guy and they're like, he's crying, and, you know, Zaphenath-paneah, this Egyptian official, and he's weeping. He's saying he's Joseph, and how is my father? And you're like, what? You know, you can only imagine what's going through their heads. But they can't answer him at first. You know, I kind of try to imagine the explosion of thoughts that are going through their brains at that point. You know, who is this guy? You know, and they might, you know, some of them might have been like, well, could this be Joseph really? And so they're wondering, you know, and they're thinking, and they're just mind blown, you know, and so they're not able to speak. And you know, 1 minute you're pleading for your brother's life and your father's life too, because they're bound up together. And next you're confronted with the fact that the man whom you're dealing with, the second in charge of all Egypt, is saying that he is Joseph, your brother. You know, what? You know, I can't imagine what is going on in these guys' minds. And so Joseph asks his brothers, who are really still probably on the ground, to come near to him. So he's saying, you know, come close to me. And so they get up and they move closer, I'm sure hesitantly. And then he tells them that he is their brother Joseph, who they sold into Egypt. He has already heard them talk about their shame and guilt from the evil that they did against him. And, you know, he was in the room when they were talking about that. And so he quickly tries to comfort them. He tells them not to be distressed or angry with themselves because they sold him. Don't worry about that, he says. He doesn't pretend that they didn't wrong him. nor does he make excuses for them, like, oh, it wasn't your fault, or you were just younger back then. He doesn't do any of that kind of stuff. He says, don't worry about it, don't worry. But he does explain the real reason why all this is happening. God planned to send him to Egypt before his brothers to preserve life, to preserve a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for them many survivors. And so the idea is that God sent him to Egypt to preserve Jacob's family, right? To preserve the brothers, to preserve their children, so that a remnant of them would be alive, so they would stay alive. It was God, not them, that sent Joseph to Egypt, which is a very interesting and very very correct way to look at it. Joseph could have sat there and complained and cast blame on his brothers, but Joseph had a godly perspective on what happened. Joseph learned that God could use the evil and the schemes of wicked men and the suffering of his children to bring about good. A good that they couldn't even have dreamed of. And that's a great point, because oftentimes we look at the bad situations that we're in, the bad things that are happening in our lives, or whatever it might be, and we don't see what God is doing. That maybe God has sent you here for this purpose, for this reason. And we might not ever get to put those pieces together. But God does that. That's what he does. And we see it with Joseph is case in point, that God often uses suffering and pain and all those kinds of things to move his people where they need to be so that he can help other people, whether it's to bring them to faith or to keep them alive or whatever it might be. And so here we have that with Joseph. Now Joseph also gets them up to speed on what all is going on. He tells them that they are in the year 2 of the 7-year famine. So they're like, he's like, the famine's bad, guys, but guess what? We got 5 more years. He explains that he was a father to Pharaoh. Or in other words, he was an advisor or the closest counselor to the Pharaoh. And he was Lord of all of Pharaoh's house. And ruler over Egypt too. So he was, he's kind of catching them up on what's going on. Hey man, guess what? I'm second in charge of Egypt. I'm like a father to Pharaoh. And so he tells them all what's going on. He also reveals to them that he has a plan. This is not just, he's not just winging it here. There's been a plan. There is a plan, which is actually kind of, revealed by God and helped along by God. And so he tells them that they need to go to Jacob and tell him that his son Joseph was made Lord of all of Egypt by God. They are to come and live in the land of Goshen. And he will provide for them. For the next 5 years of the famine, they're going to be provided for. No problems. No issues. But Jacob needs to come down to Egypt, and all the family needs to come down too. Now as Joseph is talking, he sees that they're starting to grasp what is going on here. And he says, now your eyes see, he says. So you can see, okay, now he's been going through this. He explains what's going on. He's talking about the plan, talking about the famine, talking about who he is now and how he got to where he's gotten. And now he says, now your eyes are seeing. Now you guys getting what's going on. Now you see it's me, Joseph. Again, he repeats that they have to go to Jacob and bring him to Egypt. Then he walks over to each of his brothers, and starting with his full brother Benjamin, and hugs and weeps on them. And he goes to each one and does that. And finally the brothers are convinced. And they begin to be able to talk. Because the whole time there's no record of them actually saying anything. They're probably just, I can imagine them just standing there like, what? What? We sold this guy into slavery. We thought he was dead. And now he's alive and he's in charge of Egypt. That is insane. It's blowing their mind. But that's what God does. Now, all his brothers had been forgiven, right? All had been forgiven. Everything is okay. He makes sure that they know that he's good with them. And no doubt they had many questions. And Joseph had lots of stories to tell. I mean, he could have told them about what happened with Potiphar and Potiphar's wife and all that, and how he got out of jail, and how he's, lots has happened. God has done a lot in his life since the last time they met. But all had been forgiven, and the brothers who were, all had obviously grown in age, have grown in maturity and in faith. Now they're closer than they'd ever been, right? The fact that they could weep together and hug each other, we don't even have that recorded anywhere else. That they did that before, he was 17 years old. We don't have that. So it seems now that since all this stuff has happened, everything has gone on, now they're probably closer than they've ever been in their whole lives. Well, William Cooper, in his hymn, God Moves in a Mysterious Way, captures the idea of what Joseph says here. Here's what Cooper said. God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. And you fearful saints, fresh courage take. The clouds you so much dread are big with mercy and shall break in blessings on your head. His purposes will ripen fast, unfolding every hour. The bud may have a bitter taste, but sweet will be the flower. Blind unbelief is sure to err and scan his work in vain. God is his own interpreter, and he will make it plain. I found that very fitting. Those words are very fitting to Joseph's story. I'm not sure if Cooper was intending to write about Joseph, but the idea that God is his own interpreter. We saw that with the dreams of Joseph and the dreams of Pharaoh, and how God interpreted his own dreams that he gave to other people. And if they were unbelievers, they would be scanning everything that was happening and wouldn't know what was going on. But since Joseph was a believer, and I'm guessing most of his brothers were too, at that point, they could scan everything that was going on and be like, yep, this is God. God is doing this. God's got something going on here. We don't know what it is. We don't know the full plan, but we know something's happening, and it's God. So remember that as you go throughout the day today, thinking about the things that you're going through. Think about the hardships of Joseph, even the hardships of the brothers. All that worked out together to preserve their family and to keep that line of the promise that there would be one day an offspring that would crush the serpent's head. That had to keep going, and that was going to go through Jacob into really Judah's family and continue on. So amazing stuff, awesome stuff in this chapter. So come back tomorrow and we'll take a look at verses 16 through 24, and we'll see what happens with Pharaoh and with the news that his brothers, Joseph's brothers, had come to visit him.